Today we will be discussing Chapter 4 magazines. Welcome back to TVRA 134 Media Appreciation. In this unit, we'll trace the early history of magazines, including highly politicized purpose in colonial and early America and their transformation into the country's first national medium. Examine the turning points in the evolution of modern American magazines, such as the emergence of muckraking as magazine reporting style and the rise and fall of general interest magazines. We'll also take stock of the many types of magazines specialized for particular audiences, discover how magazines are organized and how they operate economically, for instance, how they make money. Consider how magazines today affect the health of our democratic society. A magazine is a collection of articles, stories, and advertisements published on a non-daily cycle in a smaller tabloid style rather than a larger broadsheet newspaper style. A magazine is a collection of articles, stories, and advertisement published on a non-daily cycle in a smaller tabloid style. Remember that definition. And the word magazine comes from the word French magasin, meaning storehouse. In Europe, magazines became channels for political commentary and argument. Here you'll see the cover of a Rolling Stone magazine with Pope Francis on the front, which was an odd juxtaposition to have a religious figure on a pop music magazine. The story of Cosmopolitan. Helen Gurley Brown was the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine for more than 30 years, starting in 1965. Her vision was to create a magazine for young single professional women, helped make the publication an international success. She had written the book Sex and the Single Girl, a bestseller. The 1886 version of Cosmopolitan was also targeted at women, but often those who were married, with articles on cooking, childcare, and household decoration. Its fashion articles were those of Victorian style. It was John Brisbane Walker who turned it into an illustrated literary and journalistic magazine. The magazine grew in prestige and earnings until it was sold at a profit to William Randolph Hearst, a competitor and powerful newspaper publisher who turned Cosmo into a muckraking magazine focused on digging up dirt against big business and corrupt politicians. Of course, this did bring in money. After a while, Cosmo returned to its more literary content focused on women, but by the mid-60s got stale. That's when Helen Gurley Brown enters the picture. She helped spark the sexual revolution, focusing on love, sex, fashion, and careers. Today, it remains very popular and maintains a popular website and mobile version for smartphones. Since the 1960s, Cosmopolitan magazine has effectively been marketing to single women ages 18 to 34 rather, and even in the digital age, the publication is one of the most popular magazines among undergraduate college women. These women might be reading the same magazine that their great-grandmothers read decades ago. Of course, it's going to look very different. Cosmo's ability to reinvent itself repeatedly for over 130 years testifies to its remarkable power of magazines as a mass medium to adapt and shape American culture and society. The first magazines, 18th century. There was one called The Review, had the first political magazine appearing in London in 1704, edited by a man named Daniel Defoe, printed sporadically until 1713 to about 1714. Other magazines from this time, Tatler, Spectator, and Gentleman's Magazine. Other magazines from this time offered poetry, politics, and philosophy for London's elite and served a small readership of a few thousand. Here's the look at a bunch of different magazines that you might see on newsstands today. Some have changed dramatically through the years. You can see TV Guide there, Girls World, Sports Illustrated, National Geographic, and Life, some of the most popular magazines of all time. So there are really three types of magazines. Those are consumer publications, trade and technical magazines, and company magazines. Magazines became the country's teachers. Subscribers depended on them for news, culture, and entertainment. Magazines became the country's teachers by being available for people to look at, and thus trying to learn to read and learn about specific topics. Now, remember, there wasn't the internet back then. So where did you go to find information? You couldn't just Google something. You had to go to a book or a magazine or a newspaper or some other type of printed material to find information on something. So it taught you a lot of different ideas and things and literature, etc. Some of the early magazines included Godey's Ladies Book, who had a female editor, Sarah Josepha Hale. And you can see the illustrations on the front of that magazine, not photographs. Notice that. Okay, magazines in colonial America, magazines started out in Europe as infrequently published periodicals that looked like newspapers and contained political commentary. Since the 1740s, magazines have played a key role in America, becoming a mass medium. Like newspapers of the time, colonial magazines served politicians, the educated, and the merchant class. First colonial magazines appeared in Philadelphia in 1741. Andrew Bradford started it all with American Magazine and a monthly view of the political state of the British colonies. 3 days later, Benjamin Franklin launched his General Magazine and Historical Chronicle. There were about 100 magazines by 1776, most, however, reprinted articles from London newspapers. Between 1800 and 1825, about 500 periodicals had come and gone. There were high delivery costs at that time, and most communities had their own weekly magazines by 1825. The idea of specialized magazines devoted to certain categories of readers gained momentum, led to creation of religious magazines, literary magazines that printed works of famous writers, professional magazines for law and for medicine. First general interest magazine was the Saturday Evening Post, launched in 1821. News, poetry, essays, play reviews, and the writings of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and also the first advice column, and that was called Ladies' Friend. The growth of the magazine market. There was a demand for national versus local magazines soaring due to improved mail delivery, rail transport, and better printing. Illustrations really make a difference here. Drawings, engravings, and woodcuts make for interesting visual performance. Magazines started targeting females. Sarah Josepha Hale started Ladies Magazine, advocated for women's education, work, and property rights. It helped to educate lower and middle class women who were denied education at that time. So, the evolution of modern American magazines. A magazine's circulation is the number of copies it usually distributes for each issue. It's one of the main factors used to determine how much money they will charge businesses to advertise in the magazine. The Postal Act of 1879 assigned magazines lower postal rates. In 1870, 1,200 magazines were produced in the U.S., and by 1890, there were 4,500. The combination of reduced distribution and production costs enabled publishers to slash magazine prices from 35 cents to 15 cents and then 10 cents. Advertisers, what did they do? Since circulation had skyrocketed, this increased ad revenue, used magazines to capture attention and build a national marketplace. The Ladies' Home Journal, first with a circulation of 1 million people, featured exposés which inspired legislation for the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Here are a couple modern American magazines. Life, and you can see the cover there is from 1950, varies much from the more modern GQ on the right. culture through the eyes of the cover artist. So take a look at these Saturday Evening Post editions here. One is from 1952, the one on the left. The one on the right is 1942. So they definitely are mirroring what is going on in the world at that time, with a little bit of satire, some humor in the one on the left with the lady in the kitchen, working, seeing her husband out there relaxing on the beach. And the one on the right, no trespassing, stay out of the western part of the world here, and this took place during 1942. So social reform and the muckrakers. The rise in the magazine industry coincided with rapid social changes. Magazines allowed journalists to write in depth about issues, and the rise in the magazine circulation coincided with major changes in American society in the early 1900s. Americans were moving from the country to the city in search of industrial jobs, and millions were immigrating to the U.S. in hopes of finding new jobs. Many newspaper reporters interested in writing about social changes turned to magazines. They could write longer, more analytical pieces on corruption in big business and government, urban problems, labor conflicts, and race relations. Some of the writers built careers on crusading on behalf of the public good, often criticizing long-standing American institutions. Sound familiar? Who were the muckrakers? They were investigative journalists raising awareness, leading to regulations and antitrust laws. It was President Theodore Roosevelt that dubbed these investigative reporters muckrakers because they are willing to crawl through society's muck to uncover a story. That was 1906. He was not always a fan, but it did lead to reform like calling for increased government oversight of business, a progressive income tax, and the direct election of U.S. senators. Speaking of muckrakers, here's Ida Tarbell. She would tackle Standard Oil and their unethical practices. Muckrakers' targets were really big business and corrupt government. You can see Tarbell's expose, The History of the Standard Oil Company by Ida M. Tarbell, where she exposed John D. Rockefeller and their unethical practices with Standard Oil. And that was part of McClure's magazine. Dorothy Parker and the Algonquin Round Table. Here's another writer I would like to highlight. She was part of a group of journalists and writers, playwrights, and literary expose writers who would gather at the Algonquin Hotel in Midtown New York, and they had a designated table that they would go to, and they would talk about the goings-on in New York, what was going on Broadway, what was going on in daily life, in the news. And they would write a lot of satirical articles, poems, and reviews. Some of the other famous writers at the Algonquin Round Table were Robert Benchley, and of course playwrights like George S. Kaufman and Edna Ferber, which wrote a lot of wonderful plays at that time. Broadway plays, a lot were turned into feature films, etc. Here's a couple covers of the New Yorker magazine. As you can see, always colorful, satirical usually, eye-catching, and you can see the one on the far right, the New Yorker's point of view, what they see. This is a very famous one. New Yorkers see New York, New Jersey, and then somewhere, California and the Pacific Ocean. So just sort of satirizing their view of the world, meaning they're ethnocentric, but that's the cover of the New Yorker magazine. Okay, we are going to take a break and go to the next slides in the next grouping.